Ijames, and as Don mentioned, I'm a curator with the North Carolina Museum of History, so I bring you greetings from the North Carolina Museum of History, where our motto is "History happens here," even in Charleston, South Carolina. So I like to warm things up by telling a little joke. So I'll share some of my Southern humor. I'm a 7th generation North Carolinian, born and raised in Winston-Salem, and as Don indicated, I'm a farmer. And one of the things I like to grow are Georgia collards. And so I share a joke. There was an old-timey Southern traveler guy coming down on a gravel road, and it's getting dark, and he is wondering where he's going to stay. You know how many country roads is dark, you don't see anything, then he sees a glimmer of a light off in the distance. A couple of people sitting on the porch, so he goes up to the porch, and he asked if he could get anything to eat, and the husband said, well, yeah, my wife just made some dinner. Come on in. We're about to retire for the night. So they go in, and she fixed some collard greens and cornbread and black-eyed peas. He says, my favorite. I hadn't had a meal like this in many years. And so he just gobbles it up and talks about how good it is. So later that night, they clean up, and the wife takes the rest of it and puts it in the refrigerator left over. And later that night, while they're in bed with her husband, she jaws him and says, hey, Johnny, well, I'll say, why don't you go out there? That bull's out again. Go out there and get him. So he jumps out of bed and goes to corral the bull literally in the middle of the night. And as soon as he leaves the house, she jumps out of the bed and goes down to the guest room to get the guests and says, hey, now is your chance. And he says, oh, you're right. And he pushed her to the side and run to get those collard greens and black-eyed peas. So I think we native Southerners can understand that, because, you know, the collard greens won't be as good as the second day, and you can't eat cornbread after it's cold. All right, so good. So again, my name's Earl Ijames, and I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about, the topic is going to be Confederates of color before and after the Emancipation Proclamation. And what I'm going to do is use some of the characters from my film, which I'm hoping will cooperate if the ghost in the machine doesn't act up too much on us, to cue a couple of characters who are Confederates of color to talk about their lives personally before and after the Emancipation Proclamation, while at the same time I'm going to lift some of the information from the textbook over. I think there's still a handful few for handouts. I hope you get an opportunity to pick some up. I was asked and was honored to be able to write one of the chapters in the textbook, which is chapter 27, the story of African American support of Confederate forces and during 1863 to 65 period, in particular of those inducted into federal African American regiments. But the emphasis for purpose of our talk will be on those Confederates of color. The war between the states was more like the Revolutionary War. I mentioned that earlier this morning when I talked about how General Lord Cornwallis actually did, and Lincoln repeated what Lord Cornwallis did once Cornwallis came through this part of the world and discovered that there were patriots of color who were fighting for their freedom and who were gaining their freedom fighting in the rebel army of 1776. And they were effecting a win for the Continental Army. And what happens is, as Cornwallis comes through literally this part of the world and going back up through my neck of the woods, he offers Emancipation Proclamation to those who will go to that particular army. And so most people of color, most African Americans, most Indians thought it plausible, thought it logical to join that British army. So as a result of that war, most of them were sourced out as Tories, and we don't have a historical record like we do of many of them. But we do have a record of those patriots of color who, I'll dare say, were not fighting for slavery. And in fact, in Raleigh, the first teacher and preacher was one of those patriots of color, a man named Private John Chavis, who served in the Virginia Light Infantry. And he was nothing less than the teacher and preacher to governors and early senators in North Carolina. So the rebel army of 1776 allowed and encouraged enslaved men like one Tobias Gilmore of Massachusetts, and Now, by the way, there was slavery in Massachusetts then, and Tobias Gilmore earned his freedom in Massachusetts from a Rhode Island slaveholder in the 1776 war. And I helped this man's 9th great-grandson, who was a firefighter in Raleigh, gain induction into the Sons of the American Revolution in 2012. And to illustrate that point, as I come into what we're going to be discussing, is after the British Army encountered the Patriots' guerrilla tactics and their employment of these men in various capacities, General Cornwallis similarly declared freedom to encourage these men to join the British. After that independence and during the first Congress of the United States, one of the first laws that was passed is the 1792 Federal Militia Act, which disallowed any future service of African Americans or people of color in the U.S. Army, and in fact paved the way for veterans of color like one James Newby, who had served this new country, to in fact be captured and re-enslaved in North Carolina. And so he had to prove a deposition of white veterans that he was in fact a veteran to gain his freedom again a second time. So, fourscore after gaining freedom from Great Britain, America faced an internal war that threatened her existence. The Civil War would be waged between the states in the Union and the states of the territory sympathetic to the more autonomous Confederate states. Initially, the federal government fought to keep the war, to keep these states that still allowed slavery from leaving the Union. But the Federal Militia Act prohibited enslaved and free persons of color from fighting in the Union Army, even if they wanted to. Now, what happens on the ground begins with one of the characters that I'm going to begin with in my film, and this is a quote. When the Civil War started, there went up a frenzied cry for volunteers, white or Negro. So Daniel and Milford Brooks were free men of color in Cleveland County, North Carolina, who would have been conscripted. This is according to their own testimony. And so they therefore preferred to join and walked 17 miles to Shelby, North Carolina, to join the Confederate Army at the beginning of the war. Now, if you look on the 1840 census, you'll find those Daniel Brooks and the Brookses as free persons of color. Before the war, before the Emancipation, obviously. After the war, after the Emancipation, I cannot find a record of Milford Brooks. However, I do find, and there are extensive records of Daniel Brooks. He's featured in my film, Earl Ijames' Colored Confederates, with a photograph of him with his family in the 1880s. And I also have found his grave located out in Georgia. And I'm sorry, his grave is located in High Point, North Carolina, and was taken by his great-grandson out in Georgia, because when he died in 1933 at age 95, he was one of the more revered citizens of High Point, North Carolina. So much so that when the brand new federal housing project was built in 1942, and I know this is kind of a bad connotation today thinking about federal housing projects, but the original intention in the 1940s was in fact a good intention. And so those first federal housing projects in High Point, North Carolina were named for Daniel Brooks. And in fact, Daniel Brooks' grandson was one of the first firefighters of color to serve in High Point. And I had the good fortune to meet his grandson about 15 years ago at an SCV presentation in High Point, North Carolina. He told me the following story, that his grandfather's portrait, and I have a picture of it in the film, hung in the High Point City Municipal Building for many years until about 1985, when, according to him, it was taken down due to political correctness. It said Daniel Brooks, Confederate veteran, and it was taken down. No one knows where the original portrait is. And then to make matters worse, his trunk, Daniel Brooks' trunk from being a Confederate veteran with his uniform in it, was stolen from his property. So, needless to say, obviously someone like Brooks has a very storied history before and after, but he just represents just a small slither of what these individuals were, who they were. Now, with the 1861 capture of New Orleans, Union General Benjamin Butler encountered the Louisiana Native Guard, which you'll see an image of over on my exhibition table on the first left, to my left, the very first from your left. After the fall of the Crescent Center, General Butler attempted to recruit these Confederates of color into the Union Army. But President Lincoln prohibited the gesture with a reminder of the federal prohibition of troops of color in the Union Army. And this is the opportunity that President Lincoln took to declare these men as contraband so that it would never be elevated to a status of citizenship and hopefully avoid the question of freedom and slavery. Now, after nearly 2 years of civil war, the Confederate Army, with the aid of people of color, were in fact defeating the Union Army. Formerly enslaved men like John Parker of Virginia served at First Manassas. Has anybody here heard of Professor James McPherson? Right, okay. Has anyone here read his 1965 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Negro Civil War? Highly recommended, because here's, I think, more than any reason why, is that Professor McPherson gained his notoriety and PhD and, in fact, won numerous awards for writing this book where he cites from primary sources that John Parker was in King and Queens County in Virginia and enslaved, and in fact was serving in an artillery battalion at First Manassas, where he describes lobbing great fodder and getting great and receiving fire and actually witnessing other enslaved men who were working those artillery batteries being blown to bits and smithereens. And this is how we come back to recount the Civil War death study, because many of those guys are not counted in that death study because most of those guys were not counted in the United States Census. So again, this particular book I would highly recommend. Wary Clyburn, a name that I'm going to come back to, escaped slavery to serve as a bodyguard in the Company E of the 12th South Carolina Regiment. Now, I have an exhibition over here of a facsimile of Wary Clyburn's 1926 Confederate pension application, and I'll come back to that later on in this presentation. And then there are free persons of color, like Private Miles Reed, who manned one of the artillery regiments, the Company D of the 40th North Carolina, which was at the fall of Fort Fisher. And along that line, Miles Reed serves as a basis for one of my, I think, more popular jokes I like to tell. Everybody here knows Henry Louis Gates, right? Well, we're going to go back to Wary Clyburn. About August 2005, while I was still serving as an archivist at the State Archives in Raleigh, August of 2005, 97-degree day. I'll never forget, a little old lady walks into the door, obviously has been just completely exhausted and misdirected to state government buildings looking for her original birth certificate. Now, a couple of things are going through my mind as an archivist is A, if this lady's looking for a birth certificate, she's in the wrong place, because we don't have official birth certificates at the State Archives. But it's so hot that I can't send her back in the heat, so she got to cool down just a little. Let me think about this, because if she isn't in fact as old as I think she is, she might not even have a birth certificate, which would require her to come back to the archives. And this was before we had access to Ancestry and things like that. So we would have to go back on the microfilm and find her, say, in the 1920 census or something, 1930 census or something along that line. So I collected my thoughts, and then I went back to ask her name. I said, what is your name, ma'am? She says, my name is Clyburn, Maddie Clyburn. My maiden name is Clyburn. My married name is Rice, but I was born Clyburn. And before I could stop, I'll call it the Holy Spirit with the unction coming out of my mouth to say, do you know Wary Clyburn? Have you ever heard of Wary Clyburn? And she says, Lord have mercy, how do you know my daddy? And I said, your daddy. Now, let me kind of bring this into focus. At this time in 2005, I had been researching Confederates of color for about 12 years. It was a project that started in the archives back in 1993 when we literally indexed every single Confederate pension application for this new thing called the internet. And so we literally went through each one, and we would go through these, and many of them would say colored. And a colleague and I, who is now the archivist at Duke University, would look at each other and we would say, we thought we were educated, but we're learning something on the job now. So we wrote a little article, and we thought praise we would get, and a huge backlash is what we got. So we said, we don't want to touch that. Well, my colleague is white. He said, no, you take it. He said, you deal with it because you're probably the only person around here who could even talk about a subject like that. So long story short, I went underground literally researching, cross-referencing these records. And interestingly, I found there are quite a few who are in fact colored. And I say, let me define mixed race: Indian, black, white, white Indian, black and white, or mixture thereof. Different states and different laws term it colored or mulatto. But it really is a variation and a mix of those American Indians, Europeans, and Africans. We get that terminology. So the term colored is a historically correct term that I use in my film that I've had many people try to change the terminology because it's not politically correct, but it is historically correct. So let me frame that. Now, so colored, free people of color comprised in North Carolina about 35,000 people out of 1 million. You might say, well, that's not a lot, but that was nearly the same number of slaveholders that we had in North Carolina. All right? So these are some real factual numbers. So going back to Miles Reed. Miles Reed is captured at Fort Fisher. And so he's documented along with many others. When I came across and I knew and I became well acquainted with people like Wary Clyburn through the historical research. So she says, Lord have mercy, how do you know my daddy? So I ran to the State Archive stacks and I pulled, this is only one of several pages, which includes depositions and letters from clerk of court and letters from other veterans to depose. Now, and let me also make a difference. He was a bodyguard and not a body servant. There is a difference. He was shot at in battle, and he was also saving the son of his slaveholder's life twice while under fire in battle. And according to his daughter, he was very skilled with firearms and a knife. So I ask everyone, and in the front of the book it says war is hell, right? So for some reason, we think that if Southern planters take enslaved people, they're bodyguards and they're over here with a platter of Grey Poupon serving someone in the Civil War battle, and that's just not the nature of Civil War battles. So he's a bodyguard in the Company E 12th South Carolina Regiment. I have researched him, located him in the 1850 slave schedule under Thomas Clyburn. The ages match. Interesting information is Wary Clyburn's information perfectly corroborated with his daughter, who had never seen this. So the conversation goes on. She says, I came back and I showed her this. She says, I have been looking for this type of documentation for 75 years. My daddy died in 1930. She retired from Walter Reed Hospital. She had Army officers tell her there were no such thing as black people, people of color in the Confederate Army. That she was mistaken that she needed to go to the National Archives and find them in the U.S. colored troops, which she did numerous times, obviously to no avail. When I showed her this, she looked at it, looked through my soul, And she says, I've been looking for this for 75 years. And at that point, one of the ladies who was with her, I later found out was one of her two daughters who were with her, says, Mama, you were telling the truth. And she says, I know he was telling the truth because I was at his funeral and I saw him buried in his uniform, his UCV uniform, and his brothers came and got his weapons from his trunk, according to what she said. So, after the war, well, let me go through the war with Weary Clyburn. Weary Clyburn, very interestingly, the son of the enslaved man of Thomas Clyburn of Lancaster County, South Carolina. Born about 1840. Mrs. Rice gave me information that corroborated what I was looking at in the slave schedule. She says, Thomas Clyburn, according to my daddy, didn't allow no beating, whooping, or molestation of people. I thought it was very important for her to say that. And then when you examine the 1850 slave schedule for Thomas Clyburn, you see very clearly 3 generations, male, female. Of course, their names are not mentioned, but a dissecting eye, God bless you, a dissecting eye can see those 3 generations. Weary Clyburn was 8. There are two young males. One is 8 and one is 9 in 1850. He could be any one of those two. Also, Mrs. Rice says, well, that's where he grew up, and Frank Clyburn, the son of Thomas Clyburn, was his best friend. They were the same age. They grew up hunting and fishing together. And here is a plantation, a cotton plantation farm in Lancaster County where 27 enslaved African Americans are living side by side in the same house, in the same residence. You know Lancaster County, people here, is isolated today. So there's no segregation. People were working to make their lives better. Now, during the war, Frank Clyburn was sent to Darlington, South Carolina officer training camp while Weary Clyburn was still on the plantation back in Lancaster County. Frank Clyburn leaves Darlington and comes to boot camp in Columbia, South Carolina. Weary Clyburn literally escapes in 1863 while the Emancipation Proclamation was in effect. But he did not go to New Bern, or he did not go to Savannah or any other Union stronghold. He went to Columbia, South Carolina to meet Frank Clyburn in boot camp. And I like to do a rendition of that meeting, which is in the film, and I'll save it for you when you purchase it and look at it. All right, so off they go to Port Royal, which is not too far from where we are now. And they were actually fighting against the 54th and 55th Massachusetts when Frank Clyburn was wounded while in battle, according to his deposition. While under fire, Weary Clyburn saves Frank's life and takes him back to Lancaster County. A few months later, Frank Clyburn is healed. He rejoins the Confederate Army, this time the Army of Northern Virginia. He receives a captain's commission, and Weary Clyburn goes with him a second time. This time they're in the Overland Campaign, and Frank Clyburn is shot a second time in the leg with a Springfield rifle, which was almost always fatal, if not fatal, required surgery, we shall say. And Weary Clyburn takes him to the hospital in Richmond, Virginia, and saves his life a second time. He's discharged in May of 64, and they remain with the Army of General Lee until General Lee surrenders at Appomattox, and they both walk back to Lancaster County. After the war, Frank Clyburn becomes a prominent Democratic legislator here in South Carolina, and eventually serves as state senator from that district in 1896, while Weary Clyburn moonlights as a painter, and then he actually is hiring his own farms as a sharecropper with different farms, and according to Ms. Rice, he would work their sons so much that their sons would run away. And what's interesting is in the pension deposition, one of the depositions that mentions a son that keeps an unruly son, and this is what she mentioned. So Wary Clyburn is really interesting. But let me go back and talk about Private Miles Reed for a second, if I can, because he's a free man of color. And Private Miles Reed captured at Fort Fisher. And these two events, Wary Clyburn and Miles Reed, are together because what we're doing in the film is we're talking about not only before the emancipation, but afterwards in this presentation. Miles Reed enlists in May of 1864 in the Confederate Army. I located actual conscription records from the Tarboro Southerner newspaper, which admonished a lot of free people of color to enlist in the Confederate Army. Now, this is not to be taken lightly because in May of 1864, General Edward Augustus Wild with the U.S. colored troops were riding a day's ride from New Bern, North Carolina to recruit U.S. colored troops as well. So they were going to the same area. So in this Edgecombe County area of northeastern North Carolina where we're talking, Miles Reed and several other free people of color had a choice to join the U.S. colored troops or the Confederates, and they chose to join this 40th Regiment where they were eventually captured at Fort Fisher, and the 36th Regiment as well. There were two different artillery regiments there that had enslaved and free people of color in them. This is what sparks, and not in my mind a controversy, but I'll tell you a story going back to Wary Clyburn. We applied and received a monument, one of the first monuments, if not the first, to Confederates of color pensioners in Union County, North Carolina, outside the city of Monroe. Now, going back to Miss Rice, after I met Miss Rice and showed her this pension application, she says, I asked her, I said, well, can I get an interview with you? And she says, I'll think about it. I'll take your telephone number. So I thought that she would call me in a few days, a week or two at the most. 2 weeks went by, 4 weeks, a month went by. I didn't hear anything. And I got to thinking, I said, maybe I scared the bejesus out of her with this. And then thought about the whole reaction of her family. And I said, wow, I hope I wasn't too overbearing. So a year goes by, still didn't hear anything. 2 whole years go by, and we're at church coaching Upward League basketball. And my phone rings, same flip phone I've had 20 years. It rings here. And this is Miss Rice. You remember? Yes, ma'am, I remember you. Can you come to my family reunion in Monroe, North Carolina, and tell my family about my daddy? I said, well, I can. She said, they'll believe you just more than they'll believe me. I said, well, but you're from Raleigh. I said, okay, well, we'll take the documentation. I'll go. And so we agreed, and they set a homecoming Wary Clyburn Day at the church, and it was 103 degrees this particular day. We went out to the cemetery, and we were just telling the story over dinner. Went out to the cemetery, and Ms. Rice recalled her daddy's funeral in April of 1930. He died the last day of March of 1930. And so we go to this cemetery that has been abandoned, and the city reclaims it, but there are no graves there, at least as part of the cemetery. So we scratch our head and say, well, we're just going to let her find it. So we're walking around in 103-degree heat. You can see we recorded it live in the film. And Ms. Rice puts a flag down right there, and we look around. Wow, okay, fine. So she left. The following day, we had some geologists from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte came out and verified that, in fact, there was a body there. Miss Rice, she invites me to her family reunion. We go, we place a marker down at the gravesite of 1930. There's no gravesite. Geologists come out, they verify that there are, in fact, a body there, but they don't know if it's male or female. So this obviously is another dilemma. So the following day, some of the folks in the SCV camp in Monroe and Union County, North Carolina, called out 2 World War II veterans with dowsing rods. Has anybody ever used dowsing rods? You know what dowsing rods are, right? When you locate water? Okay, well, supposedly it works. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not affirming this either way, but I'll tell you what happened. The dowsing rod went, supposedly, I think if it turns south, it's female, and if it turns north, it's male. So we go over with the dowsing rod, the two World War II veterans, and they turn, and the rod flips south. And one of Mrs. Rice's daughter, Mrs. Ruth, she says, "Oh, Lord have mercy, we got to call Mama." Call Mama on the phone. "Mama, there's something wrong. There's a lady in this grave." And you could hear in the background, "Oh, that's your grandma, baby." Take one step over, and that's your granddaddy. Took a step, and the dowsing rod flipped the other way. Now, this was the first time I'd heard of this, so we took the dowsing rods over to graves that were marked. Male, we knew male, female, birth dates, and they in fact worked every single time, male, female. So I said, well, I guess it's got to be him. So we wound up placing a marker there. Well, this whole story got out, and a big deal was being made of it. People were in disbelief. People were thinking we were making things up. Then there were people finally saying, yes, we have the evidence we need, aside from the primary sources. So this draws national attention, even international attention, so much so that the following year, the county of Union wanted to locate more Confederates of color and initiated a project, but also the SCV National Convention was located outside of Charlotte that year for the purpose of honoring Weary Clyburn, among other things. So another 103-degree day the following year. Mrs. Rice is exhausted, dehydrated in the hospital in Monroe. Meantime, her family is late, coming from Greensboro and Winston-Salem and Raleigh and Durham and New Jersey and places. So at the very last minute, Ms. Rice says, "Honey, can you go and tell the crowd who my daddy was?" And I said, I guess I can. So unscripted, we went and we told the story that I shared with you just not long ago. And I look down in the audience, and there's Henry Louis Gates. And he's going, "Wow, this is great." So after the speech, I go down, I shake his hand. He's like, "That was one of the best presentations I heard. Can we use it in my film, looking for Abraham Lincoln, to help people better understand the evolution, the change of Abraham Lincoln?" I said, "Sure." So fast forward, this was summer of 2008. I think it was July, August 2008. And I was working on an exhibit at that time called Thomas Day, Master Cabinet Maker. Thomas Day, free man of color, one of the largest furniture makers in the South, the largest in North Carolina, free man of color. That's another story. We're in an exhibit team meeting in January of 2009, 1 month before the film is to be released. Skip Gates calls me in the exhibit team meeting. "Earl, I'm at PBS Studios in New York, and these people here don't believe there were black Confederates." I said, "Skip, they're colored Confederates." "Oh, yeah. Well, just send me something. I said, "Well, I shared a lot of information with you when you were down here last summer. Is that not enough?" He says, "Well, they don't believe this." I said, "Well, if they don't believe you, what makes you think they're going to believe me?" He says, you're from down there. Just send me something with North Carolina letterhead from the museum, something." So I sent him Private Miles Reed's Confederate service record that said he was enlisted May 1864, Edgecombe County, in the 40th North Carolina Regiment, served at Fort Fisher. That's cut and dried, right? You think. So about an hour later, I get another phone call on this flip phone, and he goes, "Hey, Earl, they still don't believe it." I said, "Well, Skip, I don't know what to tell you. It's just an inconvenient truth for some people. But I'm going to make my own film." And before I knew it, he says, "That's great. Let me know when you finish it." And we had only been recording little excerpts, but as it turns out, my brother is a film company. Anybody here watch Carolina Panthers? Like Carolina Panthers football? Okay, you're watching 50-yard line camera is my brother, so we're good. All right. At any rate, I was able to use his expertise in filmmaking and equipment to put together a film that took 8 years to put together, 20 plus years of research. But that's a true story, and I call it the inconvenient truth according to Skip Gates. By the way, you have to see the film Looking for Lincoln, too, because it also lends itself to what we're studying. Now, so the July 1862 Confederate victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run at Manassas, Virginia, prompted the U.S. Congress to pass the Second Confiscation Act, which called for the seizure of property or contraband, as it had been deemed, from supporters of the Confederacy in the South. Additionally, Great Britain and France moved closer to recognize the Confederacy with each Union defeat. Seeking a way to reverse the tide of the war, President Abraham Lincoln wrote a draft floating the idea of emancipation or freedom to his cabinet secretary, William Seward, who we talked about earlier today. In 1860, Secretary of State Seward warned Lincoln that the Union needed a victory before Lincoln's idea could be made public. What I'm talking about here is what's called the Pre-Emancipation Proclamation. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay, good. All right. Now, in 1862, Frederick Douglass observed, there are at the present moment many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty not only as cooks, laborers, and servants, but as real soldiers with real bullets in their pockets and real muskets and ready to shoot down and do all the soldiers do to destroy the federal government, end quote. That's Frederick Douglass in 1862, saying that to a largely unwitting Northern populace. President Lincoln, having been a masterful politician, issues on September 17th, 1862, was called the Pre-Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what ensued was the bloodiest day in American history, as we already know. One of those casualties was Captain Walter Bryson of Henderson, North Carolina. If you ever go up to the mountains, Bryson City is named for Captain Walter Bryson. Captain Bryson's remains were brought home by his body servant. Different between bodyguards. George Mills, who remained and lived in Henderson County, North Carolina, as a farmer on that same land after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, President Lincoln, being a masterful politician and psychological warfare, declared victory over the 23,000 American casualties and then issued the Pre-Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln changed the course of the war between the states from saving the Union to include emancipation of more than 4 million men, women, and children of African descent. The PEP is a handwritten 7-page ribbon-bound document signed by Lincoln and William Seward with the affixed seal of the U.S. And the document, more than anything, it warns the Confederate states to end the war and return to the Union by January 1st, or he would free the men, women, and children they held in chattel slavery. January 1st, 1863, now follow this, marks a turning point for the nation. The PEP has served notice to the Confederate States to return to the Union by New Year's Day, 1863, or their enslaved persons will be declared free. Enslaved persons in Union-held territory were omitted, as we mentioned earlier this morning. The masterful psychological operative transformed New Year's Day, a day historically designated to buy, sell, and hire enslaved men, into Emancipation Day. He changed New Year's Day, a day of fretful fear for most people of color, into a day to become revered, New Year's Day. So, men like Sam Ash, and he was interesting, he served as a bodyguard to Captain Richard Ashe at the first battle, 1861 Battle of Big Bethel, Virginia. Sam Ash fired the fatal shot, killing Union Major Theodore Winthrop, thus deciding the first battle of the war in the Confederates' favor. After January 1862, Sam Ash was hired out to the North Carolina Railroad at $40 per month to serve in the Confederacy, which was more than 3 times, as you know, the salary of the soldiers. New Year's Eve has been known as First Night Watch in the African American community since 1863. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation facilitated the enlistment of enslaved and free people of color into the Union Army. As Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln called the EP, or the Emancipation Proclamation, a fit and necessary war measure. The first Confiscation Act had allowed Union employed persons of African descent in the war effort in supporting roles, but the second Confiscation Act repealed the Federal Militia Act and barred men of color from serving in the U.S. Army. And under the second act, the African Brigade was created in 1863. Now, Confederates of color served and died on battlefields before and after the formation of the U.S. colored troops. Now, this, if you take one thesis from this, I will tell you to take this thesis. Confederates of color served and died on the battlefields of America before and after the formation of the U.S. colored troops. Some of these soldiers of color were also Indians. Okay, very important to note. Indians in my home state of North Carolina is the largest Indian population east of the Mississippi River. All right. You are looking at someone who has mixed Indian blood from North and South Carolina, and many generations over it, and it's not an anomaly. I was sharing, and I do a lot of genealogy for a lot of people. And like most people in this room, most of your ancestors came over as indentured servants. Many of those indentured servants were 18 to 24-year-old young males. There were very few European women here. Does that mean those young men remain chaste? I think not. So what happens is many of those men have children by Indians and also by Africans. And this is not uncommon before the American Revolution. Before the American Revolution, there are no laws prohibiting intermarriage, at least in North Carolina, until 1830. All right, so Confederates of color like Private Hawkins Wesley Carter are the 46 troops, 46 North Carolina troops. Now, this man is someone interesting that you'll find in the 1860 census as a free man of color in Warren County, North Carolina, which is on Interstate 85 on the state line between Virginia and North Carolina. Warren County was known as probably one of the blackest counties in North Carolina, high concentration black population even today. He's a free man of color who has living in his home 2 white school teachers. Now, mind you, it's against the law for those school teachers to teach people of color in North Carolina at this time. But if you look on that census, there are 2 white school teachers living, and this man is known as an educator. Now, he serves in the 46 North Carolina the entire war in various capacities. And according to Hawkins Carter's 1927 Confederate pension application, he threw up breastworks, worked on railroad, cooked, waited on white soldiers, and fought 7 days at the Wilderness Campaign. Now, people will ask me all the time, well, Earl Ijames, what did these guys do? I like to use Hawkins Wesley Carter as a good example because I find them doing a lot of everything. There are no particular role, or very few of them are like Miles Reed, who solely serve in the artillery. So, after the war, Hawkins Carter serves and is elected as one of the first black Republican legislators in North Carolina, serving as a state senator in 1879 and 1880s. And he applies in 1927 at age 83 for his Confederate pension application while he's living with his daughter in this new place called Durham, North Carolina, at the Watts School of Nursing. So before and after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, unlike the Confederates of color, however, you had men like William Henry Singleton, and here's a good character, and I'll like to use one of the characters from my film, The U.S. Colored Trooper, to depict William Henry Singleton for purposes of this event. William Henry Singleton he was enslaved in New Bern, North Carolina. born about 1835. He sought and received permission from his slaveholder to join the Confederate Army for the express purpose of learning to become a soldier, according to his 1922 autobiography that he published in New Haven, Connecticut. This information. According to that biography, he served in the 7th North Carolina Cavalry, and after the December 1862 Battle of Kinston, North Carolina, or Kingston, named for King George III, in southeastern North Carolina. Kinston, after the December 1862 Battle of Kinston, he left the Confederate Army, crossed Southwest Creek, and headed to Union Territory toward New Bern and a place called James City, where they were recruiting colored troops, General Edward Augustus Wild, as I just mentioned. When William Henry Singleton arrived in camp, they suspected him as a Confederate spy and placed him in the brig. And it was not until his colonel came to claim contraband and return him is when the Union Army essentially vetted him and determined that here's a man who understands the Emancipation Proclamation, is taking advantage of it, and is hoping between December 14th of 1862 and January 1st to get to New Bern, North Carolina. And what he does is when he gets there and he's vetted as not being a spy, he in fact challenges the Union officers to allow him to raise the first colored regiment in North Carolina, the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry. And he says that he used his training from the Confederate Army to train these new recruits in the U.S. colored troops with corn stalks because the Union soldiers would not give them arms at that time. So William Henry Singleton, those states that after the war that he served in the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry, that in February of 1864 was federalized into the 35th United States Colored Troops, and their major action was at the large and only Battle of Olustee, Florida, where they suffered massive casualties. But that particular regiment was also garrisoned right here in Charleston after the war. And when he left Charleston and returned to New Bern, he ran into a lot of Klan activity, and he declares in his autobiography in the 1870s and in the latter part of the 19th century that, quote, he would have to leave New Bern or be hanged for killing a white man, is what he says, unquote. So William Henry Singleton somewhat depicts that a transition that has been underestimated and not really counted, and that is a transition of actual armed forces from the Confederate armed forces over to the Union armed forces to help effect victory. And that victory, according to General U.S. Grant, when he was out in the Mississippi, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, as these recruits were coming out of the Confederate Army literally into the Union Army, he says, quote, it's the best damn spy network I could have ever hoped for, end quote. So, and wrapping up, we're okay on time? Okay. So, the Emancipation Proclamation needed to be secured with a military victory and unconditional surrender of the Confederate Army. Otherwise, it had no constitutional merit. The ultimate military victory would entail conquering Fort Fisher, the largest earthen fortress in the history of the world, constructed by free persons of color like Enos Jacobs of Sampson County, North Carolina. Now, Enos Jacobs is a really interesting story in and of itself. Enos Jacobs is the definition of colored. He's part Coharie Indian, part black in Sampson County, North Carolina, free person of color. He lives, enlists, and goes to Fort Fisher, where he helps to build that fort. He returns back, and by 1930s, I think, if I recall correctly, he's about 105 years old when he applies for his Confederate pension application. Back in about 2003, I did a presentation in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I talked about Enos Jacobs. And after the presentation, a 95-year-old older white gentleman came to me And he says, Mr. Ijames, I knew Uncle Enos. Now, and I quickly in my head did the math, and the guy would have been about a teenager at the time where he's describing. Uncle Enos, when I was a teenager in 1922, I think he said, he remembers seeing him working on the cotton docks on the Cape Fear River in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And in his 80s, Uncle Enos could pick up a flat of cotton. All right? So he says we would just go down there and watch those guys work because it was an incredible sight to me. So Enos Jacobs, before the war, free person of color. After the war, he's working on the cotton docks at Fayetteville, and at age 80 some odd years old, still able to lift a flat of cotton. All right. So the fort was largely constructed by enslaved men, however, like Aaron Perry of Union County, North Carolina, who also served as a bodyguard in the 37th Regiment of North Carolina. Now, Aaron Perry has a very good interest in history. He's born enslaved in what's called Old Anson County about 1840. Anson County was split in half in 1842, and Union County was formed. And Union County sends its own regiments. Union County, slaveholder of Aaron Perry, sends him to Fort Fisher and is constantly writing letters and sending medicine and wanting to know how is he doing. And when he determines that he is doing poorly, he sends for him to return home. When Aaron Perry comes back to Union County, he's healthy enough to actually apprehend, arrest, what we find according to the Union County pleas and quarter sessions. He receives a bounty of $10 for, I think it's $10, I might be mistaken, but he receives a bounty from the court for apprehending what's called Yankee soldiers at gunpoint and arresting them and bringing them into court. Aaron Perry also was a preacher, like Reverend Brooks, Daniel Brooks, after the war. He served bringing the word, bringing the ministry of Christ to people, and uplifting not only the freedmen, but the whole society. And Aaron Perry not only preached the gospel, but we found records of Aaron Perry in the Monroe Inquirer Journal newspaper during World War I, selling World War I bonds to help the troops. So before and after the Emancipation Proclamation. So many Indians, as I mentioned, from Robeson County, North Carolina, also worked on the fort. And for y'all who know, 95 highway goes straight up. And those two counties that are on the North and South Carolina line, for many years, a lot of folks did not know what state they lived in, because of the artificial line that runs between Robeson County, Marlborough County, South Carolina, Dillon County, South Carolina, and Bladen and Columbus County. It's all swamp in there. So there's a place where many Indians over many centuries coalesced in that area of the country. And so when the war started, many of those folks were conscripted to build Fort Fisher. One of the biggest Reconstruction riots, we can say, is the Henry Berry Lowry gang. Has anybody heard of them? Henry Berry Lowry. If you don't have a flip phone, you can pull out your smartphone and Google it. Henry Berry Lowry and the Lowry gang, 1872. They were reacting against crimes of Confederate home guard committed against their Indian brethren, literally taking them to Fort Fisher and enslaving them to work. So after the war, they start a semi-vigilante revolution, depending on who you ask, that lasts, you might say, literally up until today in Robeson County, North Carolina. So, but the Indians are one underestimated point. And I ask people many times, if you are an American Indian in 1860, and you have a choice to join a Confederate army that's offering you your land back, or a Union army that has taken your land and violated more than some 300 treaties and counting, what would you do? That's not rocket science, I don't think. So many Indians, like Thomas's Legion, the 23rd Regiment, which you saw, I hope this thing doesn't act up. On the screen here, well, it's acting up. It's not going to. There we go. No, I'm sorry. The 45th Troop Reunion of North Carolina Troops is a photograph here from High Point, North Carolina in 1925. Here's another Harvard University Skip Gates question that he used to ask me a lot. Earl Ijames, how many black or colored Confederates are there? That's a good question, to which I wish I had a precise answer other than Archives in Heaven only knows. But what I do is I cite population statistics to corroborate what I believe and what I've seen from the records is going on. The population of North Carolina in 1860 is about 1 million people. 334,000 are enslaved. About 30 to 35,000 are free people of color. The 660,000 who remain are European descent. And recently, it's interesting I mentioned that, but doing DNA. Anybody here been doing DNA? Okay, good. It's one thing when you find different piles of wood in the genealogy pile from the paper record, but it's another thing when you find it in the DNA. But I'll tell you, based on the historical research, about 8 million whites in America today, in fact, have the one drop Negro blood rule in their veins. About 8 million known and counting. And this reflects, again, going back to what was going on during the colonial era. All right? Not necessarily during the Jim Crow era because it was against the law in Jim Crow era, but in colonial era, it was not. In fact, it was kind of the status quo, the norm in the colonial era. So the population is about 1 million. 1/3 of them, of the population, is black. In the photograph, I hope it comes back up for us, but I'll describe it. And if it doesn't come out, you'll just have to get the film. We have, here we go, 4 out of 12 were colored. Now, this image shows 1, 2, 3, the black men. This was taken in about 1925, veterans from the 45th North Carolina Troops. One of these men, and I'm almost afraid to press play, but I'm going to do it. One of these men appears to be Occaneechi Indian, which is an Indian tribe that migrates down from Virginia into what's about present-day Hillsborough, North Carolina area, and Orange County around Chapel Hill and Alamance and Burlington in that area. They came down from Virginia in the mid and early 1700s. But they were free people of color when they arrived here. They joined the Confederate Army. This particular image, it shows 12 veterans, 4 are colored, 3 black, 1 Indian. Perfectly corroborates with the demographics of the state of North Carolina and the demographics of those counties of Guilford, where High Point and Greensboro is located, and Caswell County and Rockingham County, North Carolina. Now, another way that I like to talk about these numbers is to talk about the first monument erected in American history to Confederates of color. And the Wary Clyburn Monument led to a larger monument and expansion of the Confederate memorial at the courthouse, at the historic courthouse in Monroe, North Carolina, in Union County, North Carolina. The 1911 Confederate Monument was amended 100 years later to include the research names of 10 Confederates of color from that county who applied for their pensions, including Wary Clyburn. This is a facsimile of the monument that you'll see when you visit Monroe, North Carolina, to see that monument. I think they have a historic 1885 courthouse that you probably want to see. It's also a museum now. But the The 10 names on that monument perfectly reflect the demographics of slavery and race and freedom. 9 of those men are enslaved, including Wary Clyburn. The only one who was free at that time of enlistment is a man named Jeff Saunders, a free man of color. So let's go back to that 300,000 number. 335,000 enslaved people, about 30 to 35,000 free people of color, 1/10. This is 1 out of 10 are free in here. So citing those two sources, I can say with confidence that I think that the Confederate regiments reflected the demographics of the counties from which they are extrapolated. This is not unlike all of the Confederate regiments that they raised. And it also beckons to the fact that the Confederacy, probably the number one factor in recruitment, was attrition and manpower. And in the film I talk about here in South Carolina, for an example, 700,000 residents lived in this state counted in the 1860 census. 400,000 of them were enslaved, 4 out of 7. So do you think the state of South Carolina and raising the regiments are going to leave 4 out of 7 able-bodied men idle? I think not. And it's reflected, I talk about a site in the film at Pocatelego on the way down 95 or past Pocatelego Creek. It's in the film, a rendition of it, where a Union officer reports seeing 600 plus colored Confederate troopers crossing in uniform the creek. And there's an illustration of it. So, in summation, Confederates of color existed before the Emancipation Proclamation and resulted in the creation of the U.S. colored troops. And they also existed after the Emancipation Proclamation and the creation of the U.S. colored troops. And it could be exemplified in Wary Clyburn actually serving and fighting against those colored troopers, whether it be at Port Royal or someone like Hawkins Carter at the Overland Campaign in Virginia, or at the Crater in Virginia. Or it could be illustrated in probably the most famous example that I'll leave you with, and that is the bodyguard to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Is Mr. Mixon here tonight? Yeah, there he is. I almost wish I'd gotten you to hook up to this machine instead of that laptop, and we could show off that picture that you have. But I'll share the story. The 1862 evacuation of the Confederate White House, we know in Richmond, Virginia, President Jefferson Davis sends Varina Davis and those children to Raleigh, North Carolina for safekeeping. Varina Davis had family in Warren County, North Carolina, and in Raleigh. And while she was there, she was charged with hiring a bodyguard. A bodyguard, right? Not a body servant. I think she needs a body servant. That wouldn't have flown over too well. But a bodyguard. So she sends word out, and who is referred to her is a man who is labeled as a Negro Indian from Warren County, North Carolina, named James Henry Jones. Free man of color who had left Warren County, moved to Raleigh in the 1850s to help expand in the 1857 expansion of the capital city of Raleigh. Raleigh and Washington, D.C. were the first 2 planned capitals in America. And 1857 was this first expansion of Raleigh. So it needed manpower, and they called the manpower. Many free people of color and enslaved people were hired out to work for these expansions in Raleigh. James Henry Jones was one of them. But he finds a better gig working for the president of the Confederacy. And so Varina Davis takes him back with her to Richmond, and instantly Jeff Davis and James Henry Jones hit it off like soul brothers. They literally stayed together from May of 1865, or when he returned, May of 1862, when Varina Davis returns, to literally when President Jefferson Davis was captured at Irwinville, Georgia in May of 1865. It was James Henry Jones who was with him. And James Henry Jones is the only person who refuted the fallacy that was created by the Union Army that President Jefferson Davis was dressed in drag. According to his testimony that he repeated many times during the Reconstruction era, is that particular day it had been raining on and off, and that he had thrown one of those old-timey ponchos over top of the president to keep him from catching the cold. And not long after that is when they were apprehended. So it was Jones, who's in the Reconstruction era, who's telling the real story, and then there's this new fallacy that circulates during Reconstruction that starts with the slanting of the Confederacy with the presidency. So fast forward to 1889, when Jefferson Davis dies, and we all know about the funeral procession train from Monterey, Louisiana, across the South into Jackson, Mississippi, and across Alabama and Atlanta, across Greenville, South Carolina, Charlotte, Greensboro. Well, the trip was to leave Greensboro to go into Virginia, but at the last minute, the governor of North Carolina, I think his name's Elias Carr, and a bunch of dignitaries arranged for President Jefferson Davis to lie in state at the state capitol in North Carolina in May of 1893. Planned an elaborate ceremony for this gathering, and even the New York Times picked up this story. And the New York Times talks about all the pomp and circumstances to be surrounding this particular event. And yet the one person it names by name is James Henry Jones will be in attendance. So in 1893, it was common knowledge of who these Confederates of color was. They were still living. People knew who they were. People knew their exploits in battle. People knew what they had done after the Reconstruction era. But here's James Henry Jones. After the war, he comes back to Raleigh. He serves as a doorkeeper at the state capitol for many, many years. And then it's Jones who is asked by Verena Davis to be this honorary pallbearer and pull the president's casket into the state capitol. During this ceremony, Verena Davis presents James Henry Jones with Jefferson Davis's original 1855 cane made in Leeds, England. And I think Mr. Mixon might have a copy of the cane, and you can see and look at it. But this is a tremendous gesture in 1893. We're talking about a time when post-Reconstruction had morphed into extremism, to label it politely. And here is Verena Davis coming down from New York and giving this black hero, this man, his just due by giving him this cane in his public gesture, and for historical posterity, because I think she understood the time. She understood that, I believe she understood that it was against the social mores of 1893 for a black man to have a cane per se. He's supposed to have a walking stick, if anything, in public. So she presents this to him at the state capitol in Raleigh. Second thing, she has it actually engraved for historical posterity to James Jones, faithful memories, Mrs. Jefferson Davis. So in the film, you'll see a photograph of James Henry Jones holding the cane, and the cane itself is one of the first items that the founder of the North Carolina Museum of History, Fred Oles, acquired for our collection in 1914. But in ending this story, James Henry Jones, after that, was hired by a Mississippi U.S. senator to work at the U.S. Capitol. He becomes kind of the Southern rock star from 1893 until he dies in 1921. And the biggest question that most people have for him is, Mr. Jones, where's that Confederate gold? All right. So he never relents. And the second question is, Mr. Jones, where's that Confederate seal? Well, evidently, President Jefferson Davis gave the location of all that information to James Henry Jones and James Henry Jones only. And James Henry Jones took it to his grave when he passed in April of 1921. And you can see online the Raleigh News and Observer from that month, top of the fold headline about how prominent he was and what he meant to all society, not only black community, but the whole community then. So I say all that to say is that these Confederates of color, as I end up with this photograph that I'm going to talk about in ending, is the owner of that photograph is the granddaughter of Sergeant H.L.P. Watson of the 45th North Carolina. And she says that when she was growing up as a little girl, she vividly remembers every 4th of July, around the 4th of July, having these reunions of the Confederate veterans and their whole families, and it was the biggest, most fun event she could remember, the most fun she had in her life. 1920s up to about 1930. She goes off to college, and when she returns, all the veterans have passed away. That's one thing she knows, but what she stated to me, the most pointed thing that really got her attention was that all of the white people on this side and all the black people on that side. And she says, Mr. Ijames, when did segregation happen? I said, that's a good question, because segregation in our state came in with the 1901 Constitution. However, there's no sheriff in the state of North Carolina that would arrest a Confederate veteran for violating segregation ordinance. But when that generation passed away, everyone was subject to the vile laws of segregation. And that even meant Confederate veteran reunions. So I'll leave you with hope is that fortunately, these guys who were, I'll call it Jim Crowed out of history, for lack of a better word, we're hoping to bring them back to the status of what James Henry Jones was known as and what people knew of Weary Clyburn, and people knew these men and their exploits and their honor back in 1893 and 1900. But it's today we have to re-educate ourselves to understand, and I think it will lend itself to helping us have a better understanding of how we all earned our freedom and share this great nation. So thank you for your kind attention. Yes.